Daf Lamed Vav Amud Aleph, the second line from the top. We learned in the Mishnah that a Sofek Erev, if there is an Erev and it's a Sofek, it's a doubt if it was intact when on the onset of Shabbos, if it was Truma, whether it became Tomei on the onset of Shabbos. Rameir says that if it's a Sofek of the Erev is intact or edible, then you cannot rely on it and the Erev is not valid. But Rav Yossi said that Sofek Erev is kosher. However, we learned in a Braisa that if a person is Tomei with the Tumah D'Rabbanan, and it's a Sofek if he was Tovel properly, or that the mikveh that he was Tovel in is kosher, if it's a Sofek D'Rabbanan, then Rameir says in that case, we can say that it's valid. We rely on it and say that it's valid, rely on the Chazaka. But Rav Yossi says, no, that you cannot. So it seems to be a stira in Rav Yossi. Legabe the Eruv, he says that a Sofek Eruv is kosher. And Legabe the Tumah, he says that we have to be machmir. So, Frag the Gemara Kasha, the Rav Yossi, it seems to be a stira of Rav Yossi in the two cases, the two dinim of Rav Yossi. Amar Rav Huna Bar Chinana, Shiny Tumah, Hol V'yesh Leikimena Teira. He says there is a difference between the two. In the two Mishnayos, we can resolve it in that in the case of Eruv, and we're talking our Mishnah by Eruv, the case of Eruv, it's a D'Rabbanan. So therefore, by a Sofek, we're Mekel. And we say Sofek Eruv is kosher. The Mishnah that's talking about the being Tovel, and it's a Sofek if it's a Tovel, it's talking, even though it is talking about a Tumah D'Rabbanan, but Tumah has an Ikr Midaraisa. The fundamental dinim of Tumah are Min Torah. And therefore, even though this particular case is Rabbanan, but as Rashi explains, if we're Mekel in this case, we'll be Mekel in other cases of Tumah. And even in case of Tumah D'Oraisa. So therefore, by the case of Tumah, we're Machmir. But by the case of the Eruv is the Rabbanan, and therefore, we should, therefore, where Rav Yossi says in the Mishnah, we're Mekel. Sofek Erev is kosher. In fact, more Shabbos Nami D'Oraisa, but Shabbos is Min Torah. So this is involving a din of Shabbos. So why would Rav Yossi say by Sofek Erev that it's kosher? More answer to some Rav Yossi Tchumin D'Rabbanan. Rav Yossi holds that the etzem din of Tchumin is D'Rabbanan. Now, even though by Tumah we say where it's a Tumah D'Rabbanan, we're Machmir, but that's because the fundamental dinim of Tumah, the Iker is Midoraisa, and people will not really be aware that this is D'Rabbanan, that's D'Oraisa, they'll come to confuse it. But Tchumim is not a Malacha. Now, even though it's involving Shabbos, but it's not a question of a D'Rabbanan with a Malacha. It's a different category. It's a Tchum, walking in the Tchum, which is B'chlal, not a Malacha. So it's clearly distinct in a category of its own, and he holds that it's D'Rabbanan, so that's why he says the Sofek Erev is kosher. Or you can give another teretz that really he holds that it is a Tchumim or D'Oraisa. And really, Lishit also, he should also be Machmir by Tchumim. But Hadideh Hadarabbe, when we said in the Mishnah that it's kosher, that is, when he said that it's kosher, that's the Mishnah, that our Mishnah is going with the sheet of his Rebbe. Hadideh in the Mishnah that's talking about the Sofek by the Tzvila being with Tomei and his Tovel, that's Dideh. Hadideh, that's his own sheet. The Rabbi, when he said in our Mishnah that Sofek Erev is kosher, it's a sheet of his Rebbe who holds that Tumar D'Rabbanan. They can Amadiktani, it's Medui, because the way we learned the Amar of Yossi of Tumas Him Mishum Chamisha Zakenim, that Amar of Yossi, that of Tumas was made in the name of 5 Zakenim Sofek Erev kosher, meaning that's not Rav Yossi's personal opinion. That's not his own sheet. That's what's related in the name of Rabbim. Rav Omar, Rav gives another explanation. Hasam Hainu time of the Rav Yossi. Why does Rav Yossi say that we are machmir by the case of Tumah? Because Hemet Tomei al Chazkos V'emeloi Tava. Say, put the person as Chazak. If the person was Tomei, you don't know if he removed the Tumah. You don't know if it was a kosher tefillah. Leave him on his Chazak, leave him in the status that he is, and he's Tomei. Adarabba, Hamid Mikval Chazkos V'emeloi Chaser. Adarabba, the mikvah had a cheskes kashrus. So why don't you say, leave the mikveh on its chazaka, and therefore you can assume that it's a kosher mikveh, and therefore assume that the tefillah is a kosher tefillah. Why don't we say put the mikveh on its chazaka? The more answers, but mikveh shaloi nivded. In that case, we would leave it on a chazaka. But we're talking in a case where the mikveh was never measured, so the mikveh never had a cheskas kashrus, so we don't have a chazaka of the mikveh. All we have is the chazaka of the person, of the gavra who was tomei. We say leave him on his chazaka. You can't change his status, and we have to assume he's tomei. Tanya, we learned the Raisa case of Rav Yossi Savig Erev kosher. In what case did he say that a Savig Erev is kosher? Erev b'truma, if he made the Erev b'truma. Savig maybe ayam nitmes, Savig b'shachai sheichan nitmes. It became tomei, but we don't know if it became tomei when it was still day on Friday, or did it become tomei on Shabbos? V'chein peiros, and similar with fruit. Savig maybe ayam niskanu. So it was tevel. Now he took the maisers. Safek, if it was removed, if it was mafreshet, maybe ayom when it was Friday, and Safek mishach hashechan, or Safek when it was already Shabbos. Zeo Safek erev kosher. So these are examples of Safek erev kosher. Meaning, if the case was that when the truma, it was torn. Safek, the truma was torn. And it was the truma was torn. And it's a safek when it became tomei. If it became tomei miboid yom, then on the onset of Shabbos, it's not an edible error. It's not a valid error. If it became tomei mishach sheikha, and it became tomei only after the onset of Shabbos, that means that on the onset of Shabbos it was edible. Then the error is an error. So we say in such a case the safek error is kosher. And similarly, in the case of Paris. And the same in the case of Paris when we have a suffix when you are mafish the Truman Meiser. So the Gemara will explain the case of Bears. So Zeu suffix Erev Kosher. Aval Erev B'Truma, Rimin Erev B'Truma suffix Torah suffix Tameya, but you don't know if it was Torah, Tomei V'chein Paris suffix Niskanu suffix Le Nisku, and it's a suffix whether you are mafish or not, it's a suffix Erev Kosher. That's not a case of suffix Erev is kosher. Meaning the only case where we say that suffix Erev is kosher is when it had a chazak. So you have the case where it's truma, it was tor, it had a chazaka that it was tor, and there was a valid error. Something went wrong. It became tomei. You don't know when it became tomei. If it became tomei b'bay yom, it's not valid. If it became tomei chashech, it is valid. So you have a safek, leave it on its status, and it's a safek error if it's kosher. But if it didn't have a chazaka, a cheskes kashrus, or cheskes tara to begin with, then the safek error is not kosher. Well, why do we say by truma that the suffix is that it's a valid error because it was tor, and we don't know when it became tom? You say leave it on its chazaka, and therefore we can assume that on the onset of Shabbos it was tor and it's a kosher error. Well, by Paris we should also shtel on chazaka. And it should really lead to the opposite conclusion. Paris nami hemet tevel chaskos ve'emeloy niskanu. Well, they're saying in the case of the Paris that it was tevel. You had to be mafresh the trumas and meisers. It's a suffix when you are mafresh, where you're mafresh mibayid yom or mishach hashecha. How can you say in that case that it's suffix erev is kosher by the same reasoning that you said by the case of the truma that it's kosher because hemer al chaskos, put it on the chazaka, and therefore let us say that it was Torah on the onset of Shabbos. Here also, shtal on the chazaka, it was not niskan. It would the trumas and maishas were not mufresh. It was tevel. It was also bachila, not a kosher erev. You don't know when that status changed when you were masakin it. So say leave it on its chazaka and until the latest time that when we know for certain that it was Mesukin, that your mafresh trumas and maisers, assume it's tevel. So we have to assume that it was tevel on the onset of Shabbos. Why should it be a kosher error? The Gemara says in Echanami. That is so. That is the case. But therefore, we have to amend our understanding of the Braisa's case by tevel. Don't say it's a suffix whether you were masakin no, that's not the case. Meaning we know that certainly you were mafresh the trumas and ma'aser. We know it wasn't tevel. It was mesukin. So before Shabbos on Friday, you know that this was edible. Now it became Tomei, or rather, now it became mixed in. It became mixed in with Truma. It became Dimua, Safek Dimua. And therefore now it's not also Ba'achila. When did that status change? When did it become Nidmu? Then when did it become mixed in with Tevel or with Truma, and now you can't eat it? You don't know if it's Mibayam, no Mishchashecha, put it on the Chazaka. It was a kosher, it was edible, it was valid for an Erev. We have to assume, therefore, that it became Nidmu only at the latest possible time, and therefore on the onset of Shabbos, it was Mutabachila, and the Erev is a kosher Erev. Boyer Shmuel Barav Yitzchak Rav Huna, he asked the following question. He had 2 loaves of truma. One was tomei, one was tohor, and he didn't know which was which. And he said, let the erev be for the one which is Torah, which is edible, wherever it is. He put them down in their place, but he doesn't know which one is edible and which one is not edible. One is, one isn't. He said the Erev should be, wherever it is, wherever the Tahor one is, then that should be for the Erev. Now, what's the din? Tivoy the Ramer, you can ask the Shaila according to Ramer, who said a Safek Erev is not valid. Tivoy the Rav Yosi that says Safek Erev is kosher. You can ask a question according to both of them. Tivoy the Ramer, you can ask the Kasha according to Ramer. Adkan loy kam Ramer also. Ramer only said it there. By our case in the Mishnah, to look at the her. He said that the Safek Erev is not kosher. That's when there's no tire. Where it was a case of where it was one loaf, one was put down, and it became Tomei, we just don't know when. Then he says that you don't have a Vadai Tahara, it's a Safek Erev, he says is not valid. But over here you have one that certainly is Tahara, you just don't know which one it is. But you have one that certainly is Tahara. Dilma, if you Rav Yosi, or you can ask the question according to Rav Yosi, who says Safek Erev is kosher. Even according to Lois Loy Carmela Hasim, we only said in the case of our Mishnah, because he knows where the loaf is, he knows which loaf it is, and if in fact it's tahar, it's edible. And since he says put it on the chazaka, so we treat it as tahar, and therefore it's considered to be an eruv that's edible and accessible, so it's kosher. Safek eruv is kosher. But over here it's a safek. But Lamaisa, he doesn't know which one is Tahira, and therefore neither of them are edible, so it's not a kosher erev. He answered, he says, according to both of them, it's not a valid erev because we need a Surah Ru'uya Mi. It has to be by the end of Friday, before Shabbos begins, even before the Shemana Shmoshes begins, it has to be something which is edible. It has to be edible on Erev Shabbos. And over here, it's not. He doesn't know which one is Tahara, which one is Tameya. Therefore, you don't have a Suda that's Ru'uya Mibayim, and therefore you cannot rely on it for the Erev. Rav Nachman asks the following question. He says, this kikar, today, it's chol. So on Friday, it's chol. But Lamochar, for Shabbos, when Shabbos begins, it should be Kiddush. Now, if it's Kiddush, it's not edible. It's not a kosher erev. V'amar Erev Bazen, he said, let this be for my erev Mao. What's the din? Amar Erev Erev. He says, it's a valid erev, it's a kosher erev. So the way Rashi explains it is because we interpret his intent to be that he wants it Kiddush Lamochar when it's Vadai Kiddush, when it's Vadai Shabbos. So that means after the end of the Bein HaShmoshes, when it's certainly that Shabbos has begun. So therefore, he was already kind of the Erev from beforehand. So it's a valid Erev. Hayom Kiddush Lamochar Chol. But if he said that today on Friday it should be Kiddush, Ulamachar, but tomorrow on Shabbos it should be Chol. V'Amar Erev Li Bazeh Mahu. What is it in? Amar Le Ein Eruv Erev. He said in that case the Erev is not valid. So Maishna Rabbi asks, what's the chilik between the two? Meaning, if you say it's totally on his kavana, so just like you say when he says that Hayom Chol L'Machra Kodesh, he means it should be Kodesh tomorrow when it's Vadai Shabbos. Well, say the same thing in this case when he says Hayom Kodesh U'L'Machar Chol, when he says today it's Kodesh and today and tomorrow it should be Chol. Well, you should say the same thing, that he wants the neder, the designation to be Kodesh, is only Kodesh when it's Vadai Chol. When Hayom Kodesh, today is Friday, it's only Kodesh when it's Vadai Friday, when it's certainly Friday. But once it comes into the Bein Hashmoshes zone, that period, then it should not be a Kodesh. So therefore, you should say that the Kedusha of it fell off from before Bein Hashmoshes, and then it should be considered to be a valid Eruv, because by the time Bein Hashmoshes came, already the Kodesh has been removed from it. So it should be edible and should be a valid Eruv. So he said, in a lighthearted way, I'll tell you the answer when you measure out for me a measurement of salt. When you do that for me, when you give that to me and do that for me, I'll answer your question. So he said, Hayom Chol L'Machar Kodesh. If he said today is Chol L'Machar Kodesh, Misveik Eloi Nachle Kedusha. So you have right now it's Chol. The Chazakah is Chol. You don't know when the Kedusha falls on it from a Safek. You don't say the Kedusha Chol is Chal earlier, starts earlier. Yishtal Chazakah, right now it's Chol. It remains in that status until you know certainly that the status has changed, which means when it's a Vadai Kodesh. Meaning, the way that Ein Yontiv explains it, you assumed that the reasoning is because it's based on the das of the neder, and he had this intent, and this is what his intent was when he made the neder. He said, Hayom Chol L'Machar Kodesh. His intent was that it should only be Kodesh when it's Vadai Shabbos. He says, no, it's not the intent of the neder. The neder didn't have a specific intent. The reason why we say Hayom Chol L'Machar Kodesh is because right now it's Chol. Now, the status changes. Well, leave it on the Chazaka and remains Chol until you know that certainly the status has changed, which is only when it's Vadai Shabbos. So therefore the Eruv is a kosher Eruv because its status as Bein Hashmoshes is Chol and it's edible. So it's a valid Eruv. But Hayom Kodesh L'Machar Chol. But if it's the reverse, if today is Kodesh, so right now its status is Kodesh. He said L'Machar, tomorrow it should be Chol. So you leave it with its status on its current status, which is Kodesh, until you know that for certain it has changed, which is only when you know that it is L'Machar, it is Shabbos, is Chol. So Misveik Eloi Pakal Kedusha also minei. To say that from a Safek that the Kedusha has been removed and it's edible and a valid Eruv, we wouldn't say that. In both cases, we still on a Chazakah. In the first case, the Chazakah tells you that Bein Hashmoshes is Chol, so therefore it's a valid Eruv. In the second case, it tells you that no, that it was Kodesh, it remains Kodesh, and we have to leave it in the status of Kodesh until tomorrow, until Shabbos, when it's Vadai Shabbos. So Bein Hashmoshes, it was in the status of Kodesh, and the Eruv is not a valid Eruv. It's not edible, and it's not a kosher Eruv. Tanan Halsam, we learned in the Mishnah, Lagin Tul Yaim, if you have a pitcher that's a Tul Yaim. So if something or someone became Tomei, they have to be Tovel in a mikveh. However, in order to eat Truma or Kachim, or to come into contact with Trumas or Kachim, you have to wait till Erev Shemesh, till nightfall. For Chulin, or for Meiser, or even Tevel of Meiser, then you don't have to. It does not matame it when it's its full Yom. But for Truma and Kachim, it's full Yom, even though it was in the mikvah, but prior to nightfall, it will be matame. So here he had this pitcher which was full Yom. You were Tovel it, and though, however, it's not yet nightfall. Shemila min achavish shel meiser tevel, and you filled it with wine from a barrel of meiser that was tevel, meaning the person had a tevel. He was mafresh the truma, and then he gave the tenth to the Levi for meiser. Now the Levi has to be mafresh from this meiser, trumas meiser. So this is called tevel is called tevel of Meiser. So Meiser tevel. It's Meiser, but the Trumas Meiser has not yet been removed. He hasn't been yet mafish the Trumas Meiser from it. Now, Trumas Meiser has a din of Truma. He said that Trumas Meiser should be chal after it's dark. It should be chal. He was on Friday. He has said that the Trumas Meiser should be chal on Shabbos after dark. Dvar Kayom, and therefore the Trumas Meiser takes effect after dark. So therefore, if the Trumas Meiser takes effect after dark, after it's dark already, it had Erev Shemesh, and then it wouldn't be Matama the Meiser, the Trumas Meiser rather. It would not be Matama the Trumas Meiser. So if the designation took place before Shabbos, then it's a picture of Shul Yom, it would be Matama or Pasal the Trumas Meiser. But if the designation takes place after dark, then it's no longer a din of its full yom. It already had Erev Shemesh. It would not possible. So he said Dvorav Kayamin. But if he said that this should be for my Eruv, then it's not a valid Eruv. That we can see from here that we say the end of the day is when the Eruv takes effect. Because why do we say it's not a valid Eruv? Because we say that it's not a valid Eruv because it's still Tevel. Because the Trumas Meiser has not taken effect until the next day, until after dark. So it must mean that at the end of the day, at the end of Friday, or at the end of the Friday, we say that Sofa Yom Kaina Eruv, and therefore the end of Friday is when the Eruv takes effect. The designation for Trumas Meiser has not yet taken effect, so it's still considered Tevel, and therefore it's not a valid Eruv because it's not edible. Because if you think that the beginning of the day, the beginning of the Shabbos is when the Eruv takes effect, meaning that the end of Bein HaShmosh is the beginning of Shabbos is when it takes effect, why is it not a valid Eruv? It should be a valid Eruv, because by that time already, you have the Tevel. It's no longer Tevel. The Trumas Meiser has taken effect. It's not considered Tevel anymore, so it should be considered to be a valid Eruv. So it must be that when we say that the Eruv takes effect, it's at the end of Friday, and therefore at that point in time, the hafrosha of the Trumas Meiser has not yet taken effect. It's therefore still considered to be Tevel. It's not edible. It's not a valid Eruv. Because if you would say that the beginning of Shabbos is when the Eruv takes effect, well, at that point in time, you already have the hafrosha of the Trumas Meiser. So it's not Tevel, so what should be the problem? Why is it no longer an Eruv? So Mamar Papa says, no, you don't have a raya. You could say that the Eruv takes effect at the very beginning of Shabbos. That's when it takes effect. And therefore, in Echanami, it's not Tevel. Why is it not a kosher Eruv? Because being a Surah like we said before, but it has to be edible to be a kosher Eruv. It has to be edible still by Friday. And if by the end of Friday it's not edible, it's not a kosher Eruv, even though the Eruv perhaps does not take effect technically until the beginning of Shabbos, but it still has to be an edible Suda by the end of the day of Friday. And in this case, it's not, because the Afrosha has not taken place. The Afrosha of Trumas Meiser has not taken place until Shabbos, so therefore it's not a kosher Eruv.